Imagine waking up tomorrow morning in the Persian Gulf, the artery through which nearly a third of the world's oil flows, and Ma'unzen is on fire. Not metaphorically, literally. Tankers burning, military bases erupting in flames, and the governments of some of the wealthiest nations on Earth scrambling in sheer panic as everything they built their power on begins to crumble beneath them. Now imagine that the very war that caused all of this was a war the United States started. A war that was supposed to be quick, decisive, and surgical, but instead became the match that lit the entire Middle East ablaze, and in doing so dragged down not just Iran, but America's own most loyal allies in the state of Israel itself. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a movie plot. This is where the world is heading right now, in real time, and almost nobody is talking about the full picture. So today, we are going to break it all down. Every layer, every consequence, every domino that falls, because once this war starts, if it starts, there is no going back. Let us start with what you already know, because context is everything. In June of 2025, the Middle East shook. Israel launched one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. A surprise strike on Iran involving more than 200 fighter jets, over 330 munitions, targeting roughly 100 locations across the country, including nuclear facilities, military bases, missile infrastructure, and key military commanders. Iran's generals were killed within minutes. 9 nuclear scientists were dead before breakfast. The operation, codenamed Rising Lion, was designed to permanently cripple Iran's ability to ever develop a nuclear weapon, and to devastate its military chain of command in a single, overwhelming blow. Iran did not sit still. It fired back. More than 550 ballistic missiles and over 1,000 suicide drones aimed at Israel. Civilian areas, military targets, energy sites, government buildings, all struck. The United States, watching from the sidelines, made a decision that changed everything. American warships intercepted Iranian missile launches, and on June 22nd, U.S. bombers struck 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities directly. For the first time since the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, America was in a direct military confrontation with Iran. 12 days later, under intense American pressure, a ceasefire was announced. But here is the critical thing you must understand. It was not really over. It was never over. It was a pause, a breath before the next punch. And now, as of early 2026, the fist is drawn back again. The protests that erupted across Iran in late 2025 changed everything once more. Sparked by a collapsing economy, the Iranian rial hitting a record low of 1.2 million to the US dollar, the demonstrations spread to all 31 provinces almost simultaneously. The regime responded with live ammunition, mass arrests, internet blackouts, and mass executions. Over 6,400 protesters were killed, with more than 11,000 additional deaths still under investigation. The Islamic Republic was bleeding from the inside. And that is when Donald Trump, watching from Washington, sent a message on social media that sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry in the world. He told Iranian protesters to keep going, that help was on its way. 3 words: help is coming. And the entire Middle East went into a state of emergency, because everyone in the region knew what that meant. Everyone has been here before. They know how these sentences end. Now, analysts at the highest levels of geopolitical analysis estimate that a new military confrontation could begin within weeks. The chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces stated publicly that war was possible within 2 weeks to 2 months. European leaders, including the German Chancellor, were suggesting that Iran's leadership was in its final days. American warships and aircraft carriers, including the USS Abraham Lincoln, were already positioned in the Persian Gulf region. F-15E fighter jets were relocated from the UK to Jordan. British Eurofighter Typhoons were deployed to Qatar. The Armada was assembled, and it was waiting. But here is the question nobody in Washington seems to be asking loudly enough. What happens the day after? What happens when the bombs fall, when the missiles fly, and when the Persian Gulf, and every fragile, wealthy, American-aligned government sitting along its shores, is suddenly thrown into the center of the storm? Because Dr. Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran and one of the most quoted Iranian political analysts in Western media, has a very clear and very disturbing answer to that question. A U.S. war on Iran, he says, will not just hurt Iran. It will collapse the Persian Gulf allies of the United States, and it will ultimately damage Israel itself. Let us understand why. And let us be brutally honest about it. The Persian Gulf is home to some of the most strategically important nations on the planet: Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. These are governments that have built their entire security architecture around one foundation: the protection of the United States military. Qatar alone hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the Middle East, housing thousands of U.S. personnel and serving as the operational hub for American air power across the entire region. Bahrain hosts the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. The UAE has deep military cooperation agreements. Saudi Arabia, despite its complex relationship with Washington, relies fundamentally on American security guarantees to protect its oil infrastructure, its royal family, and its existence as a functional state. Now here's the brutal reality. The moment the United States launches a full-scale war against Iran, every single one of those bases, every single one of those governments becomes a target. Not a potential target, a certain one. Iran has been preparing for exactly this scenario for over 2 decades. After the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Iranian military planners made a fundamental strategic decision. Their primary enemy was no longer just Israel. It was the United States. And they built their military doctrine around one core question: how do you defeat the most powerful military in the world when you cannot match it plane for plane, ship for ship, or soldier for soldier? The answer they arrived at was devastatingly simple. You do not fight the United States directly on its terms. You make the cost of fighting you so catastrophically high that the United States cannot sustain the conflict. You target everything America holds dear in the region, and you target it all at once. Iran developed an enormous arsenal of ballistic missiles and drones precisely for this purpose. These are not weapons designed to invade anyone. They are weapons of mass disruption, designed to reach across hundreds of miles and strike U.S. bases, oil facilities, shipping lanes, and the governments that host American forces. During the June 2025 conflict, when the U.S. struck Iran's nuclear facilities, Tehran immediately launched missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. American personnel were at risk. The Qatari government, a government that had maintained carefully balanced relations with both the U.S. and Iran, was suddenly in the crossfire. Iran reportedly gave Qatar prior warning to limit casualties, a calculated signal that said, "We are not your enemy today, but we can be tomorrow." That warning was heard loud and clear in every palace along the Gulf. And that is why, according to multiple credible reports, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Oman have all been quietly, desperately lobbying the Trump administration not to launch another strike on Iran. Think about that for a moment. America's own allies, the countries that host its military, that depend on its security umbrella, that have built trillion-dollar economies under its protection, are begging Washington not to go to war with Iran. Not because they love Iran, they do not, but because they understand what Iran will do to them if it does. Iran's military strategy in a full-scale war is documented, explicit, and openly stated by its generals. Major General Mohammad Pakpour, commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, stated publicly that the IRGC had its finger on the trigger. Iran's chief of staff, Abdul Rahim Mousavi, warned that Iran was fully prepared to deliver vengeful blows against U.S. forces and their allies, and that Iran had shifted its military doctrine toward the offensive. The IRGC's Qatam al-Anbiya command issued a direct warning. If America attacks Iran, they will wreak havoc on every country in the region that supports the Americans. That is not a vague threat. That is a strategic declaration. And the geography of the Persian Gulf makes it terrifyingly credible. The Gulf states, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Kuwait, are tiny. The distances involved are measured in minutes of flight time for Iranian missiles. Qatar is roughly 300 kilometers from Iran's coastline. Bahrain is even closer. The UAE sits directly across the water. These governments have no meaningful independent military capability to defend themselves against a sustained Iranian missile campaign. They depend entirely on U.S. missile defense systems, systems that were already strained during the June 2020 exchange, and that cannot guarantee 100% interception in a full-scale war. And that brings us to the economic dimension, the one that will be felt not just in the Gulf, but in every country on Earth that puts fuel in a car, heats a home, or runs an industrial economy. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. Through those 21 miles passes approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply and roughly 30% of global liquefied natural gas. Every single barrel of oil produced by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Iraq passes through that strait before it reaches the rest of the world. Iran does not need to sink every ship in the strait. It does not need to close it permanently. It only needs to make it dangerous enough that insurance companies refuse to cover tankers sailing through it, and shipping companies refuse to send their vessels in. During Trump's first-term maximum pressure campaign in 2019, Iran demonstrated exactly this capability when it attacked oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. Those were limited, targeted, carefully calibrated attacks designed to send a message without triggering full-scale war. In a full-scale war, Iran has made clear it will use everything it has. The disruption to global oil markets would not be measured in percentage points. It would be measured in multiplications. Oil at $200 a barrel, 300, maybe more. Global inflation exploding, supply chains collapsing, economies that are already fragile, Europe, developing nations, emerging markets, being pushed off the edge. Dr. Morandi does not shy away from this. He says directly that a war in the Persian Gulf would cause a global economic meltdown worse than the Great Depression of 1929. He is not saying this as a boast. He is saying it as a warning. Iran does not want this outcome. But in an existential war, a war where the survival of the Islamic Republic itself is at stake, Iran will accept this outcome as the price of survival. And that word, existential, is the key to understanding everything. Iranian political elites increasingly view the U.S. military buildup in the Persian Gulf not as deterrence, but as the prelude to a second phase of the June 2025 confrontation. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said explicitly that President Trump was being dragged into war by certain elements and parties, a clear reference to Israeli influence over American foreign policy. Iranian lawmaker Mohammad Raisi warned that Iran must prepare for worst-case scenarios, including the occupation of Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, through which virtually all Iranian oil exports flow. Iranian strategist Mehdi Mohammadi put it most starkly on state television, saying that Washington's demands translate into disarming yourself so we could strike you when we want. This is the Iranian calculus. They believe, with some evidence, that the United States and Israel are not seeking a nuclear deal. They are seeking regime change, and if that is the goal, if the end game is the collapse of the Islamic Republic itself, then Iran has nothing to lose by fighting as hard and as destructively as it possibly can, targeting every American asset, every Gulf government that provides a launch pad for U.S. forces, and every economic pressure point available to it. Now let us talk about Israel. Because this is where the analysis becomes genuinely complicated, and where the consequences become deeply counterintuitive. Israel launched the June 2025 strikes, believing that eliminating Iran's nuclear program and decapitating its military leadership would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East in Israel's favor. And in narrow short-term military terms, it achieved significant results. Iran's nuclear facilities were damaged, key commanders were eliminated, and Iran's missile arsenal was degraded. The operation was, by conventional military metrics, a tactical success. But strategy is not tactics, and the strategic consequences of Israel's actions are now threatening to unravel the very regional order that Israel's security depends upon. Consider the relationship between Israel and the Gulf states. In recent years, particularly following the Abraham Accords of 2020, Israel had made remarkable diplomatic progress in normalizing relations with Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, and with Saudi normalization seemingly on the horizon. This represented a fundamental transformation of the regional landscape. Arab governments that had publicly opposed Israel for decades were beginning to see it as a potential partner against their shared rival, Iran. It was a diplomatic revolution, decades in the making. That progress is now in serious danger. Israel's bombing of Qatar in September 2025, targeting Hamas negotiators, was perhaps the most damaging single act Israel could have committed against its own regional standing. Qatar had been serving as a critical mediator in the Gaza negotiations. It had maintained stable and pragmatic relationships with multiple regional powers, and Israel bombed it. The Gulf monarchies were stunned, not because they loved Qatar or Hamas, but because it demonstrated something terrifying, that under the Netanyahu government, Israel was willing to attack a country that hosts thousands of American troops, that is officially a U.S. ally, in pursuit of its own strategic objectives. If Israel would do that, what would it not do? The message received in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait City was unmistakable. The U.S. security umbrella that was supposed to protect them could not even prevent one U.S. ally from bombing another. The foundation of their security architecture had a crack in it, and that crack was Israel. The Gulf monarchies began quietly but urgently looking for alternatives. Saudi Arabia deepened its defense cooperation with Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state, in ways that analysts read as a hedge against both American unpredictability and Iranian aggression. Turkey, already chafing under NATO arrangements, began signaling interest in greater strategic independence. The regional realignment that America's Gulf policy was supposed to prevent was being accelerated by America's own actions. And this brings us to the most dangerous long-term consequence of all, nuclear proliferation. This is the dimension that keeps the world's most serious strategic analysts awake at night, and for good reason. When the United States and Israel struck Iran's nuclear facilities in June 2025, they sent a message to every country in the world that was watching. The message was this: if you pursue nuclear technology, even for peaceful purposes, if you reach the threshold of nuclear capability without actually crossing it, you will still be attacked. Iran had been at threshold status for years. The IAEA had confirmed as recently as June 12, 2025, that Iran had enough enriched uranium for 9 nuclear warheads, but had not assembled them. Iran had exercised strategic restraint, and it got bombed anyway. The lesson is not subtle. The lesson is that restraint is punished and deterrence requires actual weapons. If Libya's Muammar Gaddafi had held onto his nuclear program instead of dismantling it, he might still be alive. If Saddam Hussein had actually possessed weapons of mass destruction, the 2003 invasion might never have happened. And if Iran had fully weaponized its nuclear program before Israel struck, the calculus of that strike would have been very different. These are the conclusions that governments in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and beyond are drawing right now in real time. The non-proliferation architecture, the global framework of treaties, inspections, and agreements designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, is being shredded not by rogue states, but by the actions of the world's leading democracies. The Conversation, an academic analysis publication, published an assessment making exactly this point, that U.S. military action against Iran risks igniting a regional and global nuclear cascade, where the rational response for every country watching is to accelerate toward actual nuclear weapons capability as the only reliable guarantee of sovereignty. Saudi Arabia already has an understanding with nuclear-armed Pakistan that many analysts believe includes access to Pakistani nuclear weapons in an emergency. Turkey is questioning its arrangements within NATO. The seeds of a nuclear Middle East are being planted right now, and the water being used to grow them is American military force. Back to Iran's immediate military capabilities, because this is where the reality check becomes most sobering for American military planners. Iran's strategy in a full-scale conflict is not to defeat the United States in a conventional sense. It is to impose costs so devastating that the political will to continue the conflict collapses in Washington before the military will collapses in Tehran. This is the logic of asymmetric warfare, and it has defeated the United States before, in Vietnam, in Somalia, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. Iran has studied every one of those conflicts with meticulous attention. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal is the largest in the Middle East. Its drone capabilities, demonstrated with devastating effectiveness against Saudi Aramco facilities in 2019 and against Israeli territory throughout 2024 and 2025, are sophisticated, numerous, and improving. Iran has Shahid drones that can fly for thousands of kilometers on minimal fuel at very low altitudes, making them extremely difficult to intercept consistently. The U.S. shot down a Shahed 139, approaching the USS Abraham Lincoln in early February 2026, but that was one drone. In a full conflict, Iran would launch hundreds simultaneously, overwhelming missile defense systems through sheer volume. The Middle East Institute published a stark assessment in early 2026, warning that a new U.S. strike on Iran would not be another 12-day war. In the June 2025 conflict, Iran's proxy networks, Hezbollah, Houthi forces, Iraqi resistance factions, and others, were already significantly degraded by years of Israeli military operations following October 7, 2023. But that degradation does not mean elimination. The Institute warned that many of these militant groups, having been devastated and left with nothing to lose, may actually be more willing to coordinate wider attacks against U.S. interests across the Middle East than they were before. Desperation is a powerful military motivator. Iran's foreign minister, Araghchi, was explicit. If the U.S. attacks, Iranian forces will strike American military bases, and it makes no difference where those bases are located. That covers Al Udeid in Qatar. It covers the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. It covers the Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, where the United States recently relocated F-15E fighter jets. It covers American assets in Kuwait, in the UAE, in Iraq. Every American military presence in the region becomes a front line in the conflict, and every government that hosts those facilities becomes a participant in the war, whether it chooses to or not. The Gulf Cooperation Council states understand this with absolute clarity. The Gulf International Forum, one of the most credible analytical institutions focused on the Arabian Peninsula, published a detailed assessment confirming exactly this, that for GCC states and Turkey, a war against Iran would not be a distant or containable conflict. It would be a disastrous shock with direct security, economic, and political consequences. Saudi Arabia and Iran had reached a historic normalization agreement just 2 years prior, mediated by China, and Gulf states had invested real political capital in de-escalating tensions with Tehran. A U.S. war on Iran destroys that investment overnight and replaces cautious stability with open-ended catastrophe. Turkey's position deserves particular attention because Turkey is NATO's second largest military and sits in one of the most strategically sensitive positions imaginable. Turkey shares a border with Iran. It has a massive Kurdish population on both sides of that border. It has been managing Iranian influence, Kurdish insurgency, and Syrian instability simultaneously for years. A war that collapses the Iranian state, or even significantly weakens it, does not give Turkey stability. It gives Turkey chaos on its doorstep, an influx of Iranian refugees, Kurdish militant groups potentially emboldened by the power vacuum, and a region-wide security environment so destabilized that Turkey's own internal pressures intensify dramatically. Ankara has been very clear. It sees regional balance, not any single power's dominance, as the key to long-term stability. An Israeli-American war that reshapes Iran serves neither of those goals. There is also the question of what comes after Iran. And this might be the most underappreciated danger in this entire analysis. Even the most hawkish American planners acknowledge what they call the Pandora's box scenario. If US and Israeli military action triggers the actual collapse of the Islamic Republic, not just its military degradation, but its total political implosion, what replaces it? The assumption in some quarters in Washington and Tel Aviv is that a post-Islamic Republic Iran would be friendlier to the West, perhaps democratic, perhaps aligned with Israel. This assumption has no historical basis and considerable evidence against it. The collapse of the Soviet Union produced not a peaceful democratic Russia, but a traumatized revanchist state that eventually produced Vladimir Putin. The collapse of Saddam Hussein's Iraq produced not a stable democracy, but a power vacuum filled by sectarian violence, Iranian influence, and eventually ISIS. The collapse of Muammar Gaddafi's Libya produced not freedom, but a decade of civil war, human trafficking, and humanitarian catastrophe that continues to this day. Why would the collapse of the Islamic Republic, a state with a population of over 90 million people, a deeply complex internal political landscape, powerful military institutions, and decades of embedded revolutionary ideology, produce anything different? The most likely outcomes of regime collapse in Iran range from bad to catastrophic. A more radicalized successor government, emboldened by nationalist fury over foreign military intervention. A fragmented state with multiple competing factions, each controlling portions of Iran's missile arsenal and military infrastructure with no central authority to impose restraint. A humanitarian disaster that produces millions of refugees flowing into Turkey, Iraq, and beyond, destabilizing every neighboring country simultaneously. Or, and this is the scenario that genuinely keeps nuclear nonproliferation experts awake, a collapse of central authority over Iran's remaining nuclear material and expertise, creating exactly the kind of loose nuclear environment that the entire framework of nonproliferation has been designed to prevent. The EU Institute for Security Studies made a point that cuts directly to the heart of the Israel question. It noted that there is no formal ceasefire between Israel and Iran, unlike the fragile truce with Lebanon struck in November 2024. There is no external guarantor. There is no de-escalation hotline. There is no mechanism for either side to communicate intentions and prevent miscalculation. The 12-day war ended with an informal pause that nearly collapsed before Trump's last-minute intervention. One misread signal, one unauthorized strike by a rogue faction, one technical malfunction interpreted as a deliberate attack. Any of these could restart the conflict at any moment, and when it restarts, it will do so in a more volatile, more desperate, and more dangerous environment than before. Israel cannot sustain a prolonged war against Iran without active U.S. military support. That is the assessment of every serious analyst. Israel's military is extraordinary, but it is also finite. It does not have the strategic depth, the logistical capacity, or the economic resilience to absorb years of conflict with a nation of 90 million people possessing thousands of ballistic missiles. Israeli society, already fractured by unprecedented domestic polarization over Netanyahu's judicial reforms, is not psychologically or politically prepared for a long war. The Iron Dome and Arrow missile defense systems are expensive, finite, and degradable. Iran can fire more missiles than Israel can intercept indefinitely, and so Israel's security in this conflict is entirely dependent on Washington, which means that anything that damages the American ability or willingness to sustain the fight directly endangers Israel. If the Gulf states, destabilized by Iranian strikes, pressured by their own populations, and terrified of economic collapse, begin withdrawing cooperation with U.S. forces, the American military's ability to project power in the region shrinks dramatically. If oil prices explode and the American economy goes into recession, the political will to sustain a faraway war diminishes rapidly. If the regional architecture of American alliances frays and fragments, as it is already showing signs of doing, Israel finds itself increasingly alone in a region that, for the first time in decades, has reasons to unify against it rather than accommodate it. This is the iron logic of what Dr. Morandi and a growing number of serious Western analysts are warning about. This is not Iranian propaganda. The Council on Foreign Relations, the Middle East Institute, the EU Institute for Security Studies, the Gulf International Forum. These are not Iranian state media. These are institutions funded by Western governments, staffed by former diplomats and military officers, and deeply invested in American strategic success, and they are all saying variations of the same thing. A full-scale U.S. war on Iran risks collapsing the very regional order it is designed to protect. The National Interest, one of America's most respected foreign policy publications, put it plainly in February 2026. Iran knows it cannot win a conventional war against the United States, but it does not need to win conventionally. It needs to make the cost of the war unacceptably high. It needs to drag the conflict on long enough that the political equation in Washington shifts. It needs to demonstrate to every government in the Gulf that alignment with America against Iran comes with a price tag that no oil revenue can cover. Given the geography, the missile arsenals, the economic stakes, and the political fragility of every government in the region, Iran has a very plausible path to achieving exactly that outcome. As of early February 2026, the situation is this. U.S. warships are circling the Gulf. Iranian gunboats are probing American vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. Drones are being shot down. Tankers are being seized. Negotiations are collapsing and being restarted and collapsing again. Iran is simultaneously fighting to survive domestic political pressure, negotiating its nuclear future, and preparing for the possibility that none of it matters because the bombs are already coming. The Gulf states are hedging, lobbying, and quietly building alternative security arrangements because they no longer trust that the American umbrella will protect them from all threats, including the threat posed by their supposed ally Israel. And somewhere in this equation, the world is watching to see whether the United States will make the decision that changes everything. Whether the Trump administration, under pressure from Israeli interests and domestic political pressures, will authorize a strike that was supposed to end Iran's nuclear program, but instead begins the unraveling of the American-built Middle East order that has structured global geopolitics since the end of World War II. The stakes are not abstract. They are not academic. They are measured in the price of the fuel in your car, the stability of the global economy, the safety of millions of people living in the Persian Gulf, and the long-term security of Israel itself. The war that was supposed to make the region safer may instead be the catalyst that makes it more dangerous than it has ever been. History is full of moments where the most powerful actors in the world made decisions they believed were rational, decisive, and strategically sound. Decisions that turned out to be the first domino in a cascade of catastrophic consequences nobody fully anticipated. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was supposed to democratize the Middle East. The intervention in Libya was supposed to liberate its people. The expansion of NATO was supposed to guarantee European security forever. What happens when the next domino falls? What happens when the missiles fly again? When the Gulf burns? When the oil stops moving? And when the allies that the United States spent decades and trillions of dollars building relationships with are left standing alone in the wreckage, asking the question that was always there but never properly answered. Was this war worth it? That is not a question anyone in Washington seems to have a satisfying answer to. And until they do, the rest of the world waits, watches, and hopes that this time, just this once, someone in power does the math before pulling the trigger.